morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Veloz webinar this morning, how electrifying rideshare meets California zero emission vehicle goals. We're really excited to be here this morning with you all. Today, we are placing all of your microphones on mute to minimize feedback. And we will be answering questions using the Q&A menu feature in Zoom following our facilitated discussion with our panelists today. Feel free to ask a question anytime during the webinar using that Q&A menu, and we'll hope to get to your question after the facilitated Q&A. So we look forward to that. I want to note that we are recording the webinar, and we will be putting a recording on our website in the next few days. So if anyone you know is missing it, they will be able to see it on the recording. So my name is Lisa Kilodikis, and I am Programs Director here at Veloz. I'm really excited to be here, and happy April 1st, everyone. I'm excited to moderate today's panel and webinar and really dive into a very important topic on how electrifying rideshare helps meet California's zero emission vehicle goals. But we can't electrify rideshare without supporting the drivers, many of which are considered low income. Electric cars have many benefits for drivers, such as lower maintenance and fueling costs, but they also have some barriers, such as higher upfront costs and the need to charge these cars. And these drivers do put a lot of miles on their cars every day. So in the end, drivers and the communities that they live in and work in can all benefit from electric cars and from the clean air from electric cars. So today we will be talking to policymakers, rideshare network companies, academia, equity advocates, and an Uber driver about the opportunities around electrifying the rideshare fleet. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to tell you a little bit about Veloz. Veloz is a public-private nonprofit made up of almost 40 member organizations, including automakers, utilities, state and local government, third-party charging providers, transportation network companies, nonprofits, and others. You can see from the logos on this slide that Veloz's membership is broad, diverse, and growing. Veloz aims to drive electric car sales through our statewide awareness campaign, Electric for All, our summits, webinars, and other programs. Our goal is to continue to engage new entities and organizations. So if you're not a member, we invite you to join us. You can visit the Join Us page on our website to learn more. I also want to tell you about our quarterly sales dashboard. Veloz produces an electric car sales dashboard that we publish quarterly on our website. We are excited with a recent partnership with the California Energy Commission and the Air Resources Board for electric car sales and charging data in California. Our sales dashboard includes California and US sales of battery electric, plug-in hybrid, and fuel cell electric vehicles, as well as the number of chargers, hydrogen stations, and makes and models available in California. This slide shows data through the end of 2020. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today that I'm excited to talk to. We have Sam Ahrens, Director of Sustainability with Lyft. We have Shin-Pei Tsai, Global Head of Cities and Transportation Policy with Uber. We have Terry Travis, Managing Partner with EVNUR. We have Jim Pyatt, Modesto-based Chevy Bolt Uber driver. Joshua Cunningham, Chief of the Advanced Clean Cars Branch, Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division of the Air Resources Board. And Molly Cohen de Alcastino, Policy Director, Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program with the Institute of Transportations at UC Davis. So I'm just going to say that much. That's a mouthful, but thanks for you all to be here. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and welcome my panelists to join me for our conversation today. Okay. So I'd like to begin, Jim, with you. So if you want to unmute your microphone, that would be great. I really just want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. Really appreciate it. And I know that I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective as well as I'm sure our participants are. So And before we really get into the policymakers and the advocates and the transportation network companies, we thought it'd be great to get your perspective as an actual Uber driver. So let's begin. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to use an electric car as an Uber driver?
Okay, well, I would say semi-retired. I spent about 30 years in the newspaper business before that started to decline, and have done some other things. But when I first started driving, I bought a plug-in electric Ford C-Max.
Uh-oh.
And I really enjoyed it drive enough that I bought a second one, because you're right, mileage for a driver is probably the #1 difficulty of how many miles you put on a car, and the value just tanks. So I bought 2 of them, basically the same car, same color, everything. And so one of them, when it got to be about 180,000 miles, the battery had to be changed. So that's another issue. Yes, your costs are minimal in service, although with the plug-in electric, you still have the engine, so you have to service that. But so there's the expense that at some point the batteries fail and you have to have them replaced or rebuilt. And that wasn't a big process. I actually had a friend who was a mechanic. We changed it, and we bought it out of a wreck, a used one out of a wreck, which I felt like I was getting to reuse something that was just sitting there, and it didn't have a lot of miles on it. So that's really where I got my taste of EV, and I enjoyed driving it when it was in all electric. So what really drove me to this was I had looked at a Chevy Bolt, but never went to look at them at a dealership or anything like that. But it had my thought process going. And when Uber sent a thing out and said, hey, we're going to give $3,000 towards a down payment, I thought, okay. And that still didn't click, that, okay, a new car, how much money it is. And then I was in Costco, and there was another $3,000 that Costco had that was, if you went to a General Motors, you could get any car. And so I said, okay, well, that's enough let's go look. And then when I got there, it was end of year model last year, September. And so General Motors had $8,500 off. So then we really had something. And then the state had a rebate and other things. So it became like, well, it was a no-brainer really to buy it at that point. And I think for drivers, knowing what those incentives are, and that's what you guys are trying to do, that makes it appealing. Because if you're going to buy that car, you're going to spend all that money on it, it's going to depreciate very quickly because of the miles you're driving. But other than that, once I got it, I love driving the car. It's quiet, it's peaceful, and all of those things. And in the beginning, I live in Modesto, and I drive here occasionally, but most of my driving, I go to San Francisco because the demand is greater. And for one other reason is there are shorter trips in San Francisco. San Francisco's small, compact. So I'm putting less miles, even though I got to drive over there and back, than here driving 15 miles to pick somebody up.
Right. So
those are some of the issues that drivers deal with. And but driving it in general, I love it. But on the side of that I found is I call it EV anxiety. Okay. I got to charge. One of the great things that Uber did during the election is they gave drivers the information that says, here's your ride, here's where you're going, how many miles it's going to be, and where you're going to end that ride. Because an example would be as if I got a ride in San Francisco out to Stinson Beach, okay, I got this many miles on my car. If I get there, is there a charger there? Doubtful. Where do I got to get a charger? So there's this whole dynamic that you work on, and you just have like 5 seconds to make that decision. So, but the information is there, which is incredible. In the old days, you had no information. It was just you hit go. And if you had an EV, if you didn't have enough miles, you'd have to be able to say, or you didn't know where you could charge, you'd have to cancel it. So this gives us the ability to process the information. And one of the things I'd like to see is us have a little more time to process that information in our mind before we make that decision. So, but as far as charging here when I'm driving at home, I have a home charger we put in that we got an incentive to put that in. So the expense of that was minimal. MID and different areas have where we get, if we schedule to charge at night, we get a reduced electric rate, which is great. Uber has a deal with EVgo. So when I'm in the city, I get a discount on my charging. So ultimately charging for me is less than half of what gas would be. And I don't have a hard number, but I believe around 30% less, or 70% less, 70, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
So, but then it comes down to when I'm in San Francisco, okay, there's the EVgo fast chargers. If I go to one and somebody's there, you know, you want to get a little bump up, and there's not a lot of Uber drivers I see parked charging. I see a lot of other vehicles, but not so many Uber drivers. So my concern is that if 1,000 Uber drivers started driving in San Francisco tomorrow, and with the charging stations there are, can we keep these cars charged and running and on the road? Right now, it's not a problem, but I see that as a problem going forward.
Yeah, we should ask our panelists about that.
Yeah. And you know, somebody said once they envisioned, well, maybe there'll be chargers instead of parking meters along the street. I don't know, but you know, they need to be accessible. And then you're always going to have that issue if you're going to remote areas, which you always will. You'll get a ride up into Sonoma County or someplace where it's remote. And can you get charged if you get there? So that is something drivers have to begin to just look at. How am I going to deal with that? And I'm getting used to it some, because I'm you know, I've been doing it now since September, so I'm kind of, it's not as stressful, but there is that stress there. So well, that's kind of my experience. And then on the passenger side, passengers will make comments how quiet it is going up hills in San Francisco, and you know, and they ask a lot of questions about it, and I love sharing my experience with them. It's a great conversation piece, and going forward, it's my hope that more and more drivers, if not all drivers, can do this, but it's how we make that work.
Yeah, and I think people like you with sharing your experiences is a big part of trying to get more drivers to engage with this technology and use it for themselves. And so we appreciate your perspective. And I honestly could probably spend the whole time talking to you about your experience as an Uber driver with your electric car. But I'm going to get to some.
I'm happy to do that at another time.
Yeah, exactly. So Joshua, I'm gonna ask you the next question. So, the Air Resources Board is a leader when it comes to emission standards for cars and trucks, and now the governor established really ambitious goals that all new cars and light trucks must be electric by 2035. What is the role of transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft in CARB's goals to go electric?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Glad to be here. We recognize that there's a strong role for transportation network companies, Uber, Lyft, via other companies that are emerging. And it has some connections to what Jim is highlighting. The benefit of high mileage vehicles, if they are electric, is strong. If we can get an electric vehicle into a high mileage application, then the amount of electric miles that we need to really get the emission reductions throughout the state goes up compared to a traditional household vehicle. So there's a strong connection to the actual metric that we're concerned about in terms of protecting public health with greenhouse gas emission reductions and criteria emission reductions. So higher EVMT. And then the other note that I was really pleased to hear Jim mention at the end is the connection to ridership. For one high mileage Uber or Lyft driver in an electric vehicle, if you can get exposure and engagement and learnings to thousands of other riders, then we hope those people will go out and buy EVs themselves or ask for them when they go to take rides. So for us, we see as an amplifier effect as it relates to high mileage Uber Lyft drivers.
Great. And I'm going to dive in. And so what is CARB or their resources board doing to address the high mileage and, the need for these kinds of companies to go electric?
Yeah, we have a couple of policies in play. There's more that's going to be needed to make sure we're supporting the rollout of these vehicles applications. The most prominent one that I'm managing is the Clean Mile Standard. We're about ready to present that to our board next month. And that'll be a requirement on Uber and Lyft to get more EVs into the hands of their drivers. So we'll have a requirement on increasing electric VMT out to 2030, a reduction in GHG emissions, and optional credit opportunities for the companies to partner with transit. So we both want to increase electrification, but also have connections to other mobility options to reduce VMT in general and congestion in the cities. So that's one core area. That's kind of our anchor, is the requirement side. The state and the agency have a couple of other incentive programs beyond my effort. And so there are new vehicle and used vehicle incentive programs open for drivers, both new and used, which would help the low-income families. So there's the CVRP and the federal incentive, both of which are really important, but are uncertain depending on the budgets. So we have emerging other programs. There's the Clean Fuels Reward Program that is increasing in size as part of the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, and then also the Clean Cars for All opportunity for used car vehicles. So vehicle incentives is critical. The third thing I would just mention is that there are a lot of investments happening, to Jim's last point on infrastructure. There are a lot of investments happening for infrastructure that have state support. We have the Electrify America effort that we're helping to oversee as an agency. There are utility investments through SB 350 and state investments through the Energy Commission with AB 8. So that's just to say that we recognize there's a priority to make sure that there's public and particularly high power DC fast charging opportunities in cities to help Uber and Lyft drivers in the areas that they're providing service. I'll probably end there, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joshua. It's great to hear. So Terry, I'm going to head over to you now. So first, I want to welcome you. You're the newest board member of the Veloz board. So we're really excited to have you, your organization, and you as a board member. So welcome. So as a managing partner of EV Noir, can you tell us a little bit about EV Noir? And then what are some important considerations for transportation network companies and the state as they roll out their zero emission vehicle goals, especially when it comes to access for these technologies with lower income communities and disadvantaged communities?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Lisa. Glad to be here with this panel of industry experts. So first, EV Noir is our consultancy that focuses on e-mobility best practices as well as e-mobility diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also have to mention that we also are the co-founders of EV Hybrid Noir, which is our membership organization, which is the nation's largest network of diverse EV drivers and enthusiasts. And as it relates to today's conversation, we have a number of EV drivers who are driving on the more popular major rideshare platforms, and really are able to get insights through this group around rideshare, delivery, and gig electrification. It's almost like our living focus group, where we can glean insight and, more importantly, provide a safe space and support network for these drivers, answering their questions, giving them insights into what the best practices are. And, to answer the question about how we get, priority communities or priority populations to glean the benefits of beneficial electrification, that's something that our team works on every day. But the idea is that it's going to take a multifaceted approach. It's not, we didn't get here overnight, so we're not going to solve the issues overnight. For the past few years, we've been facilitating quite a bit of research in the area. And as the major rideshare platforms decarbonize, it's something that, we think we're going to have to, face and deal with a number of different issues. One is just general awareness. So, if we think about this, even though, the state has a high concentration of EVs, or half the EVs in the country are concentrated in the state, the idea is that most consumers are just not really aware of the technology. We're dealing with 100 years of habit with fossil fuels, and so we're going to have to address that as well. But the idea is that we have to create awareness. Then we have to really do a more comprehensive education and outreach plan. In this research that we've been facilitating, one of the things that as resoundingly clear is that folks are really concerned about cost of point of entry. As Joshua was talking about, some of the programs that are being administered by CARB and related programs. Folks need to know more about the technology, but they need to know also about those programs. We are engaged in a number of programs that are helping to gain that point of entry for drivers. And then we need to make sure that, as Jim mentioned, that there is ample access to charging. We know for diverse consumers at every socioeconomic level, what we experience is what is called charging deserts. So in order for folks to be able to benefit from this decarbonized future, we have to make sure that there's ample charging infrastructure in place so that folks can benefit from this equitably.
Great points. And thanks for your continued work in this area. Appreciate it. And I look forward to working with you some more. So I'm going to go to Sam now. Sam, so even before the governor signed the executive order to go 100% electric, Lyft had made its own commitments to go 100% electric by 2030, even 5 years earlier. How is Lyft planning to meet this goal while supporting its drivers, especially the lower income drivers? And what is needed from policymakers, private industry, and other stakeholders to really make this happen?
Lisa, and hey everyone, great to be here with you today. So we did set a very ambitious goal back, getting to be almost a year ago. It's the COVID time warp is such a strange thing. But we set our ambitious goal of 100% EVs, and that is what we're now working towards. And the challenge, I think, is something that the previous panelists have been touching on, which is the cost of vehicles is still too high, and there's not enough charging available. Those are sort of the two fundamental barriers. And that what's interesting is that's even true with battery costs having come down quite significantly. Costs are down something like 90% over the past 10 years, which is pretty astounding if you take a step back and think about it. But even that is not quite enough. And when you start layering on the federal tax incentive and California's CVRP and some of the other programs that are available, you can't necessarily get there to make it work. And so what we need to do, basically, I think collectively, is to try to address those barriers, and there's lots of efforts to do that. But it will require partnerships between nonprofits like EV Noir and the Air Resources Board and everybody who's represented on this call and more, to create the programs like the Clean Miles Standard, which is going to be very important to make this happen. And to make sure that we're advocating for and thinking carefully about the diverse communities that make up the driver population on the platform. And I think to a lot of Terry's points, people do live in charging deserts, and overnight charging we see as a key to unlocking this, because overnight charging has two advantages. So first of all, there's just the convenience factor, right? So you're almost sort of leapfrogging from a worse charging experience today when you're trying to fast charge, when they're few and far between, and you're leaping over the gasoline experience to an even better experience where you're charging at home, and you can just simply, just like your phone, you come home, you plug it in, you go to sleep, don't worry about it in the morning, boom, you're ready to go. The other thing about home charging is that it can be cheaper. And this kind of gets to one of Jim's points, that you can have differentiated rates depending on the time of day you're charging, and particularly overnight, you can have a cheaper rate. And there's less kind of electrical infrastructure that's needed. So if you're going to put in a fast charging station somewhere, you've got to have some pretty big and beefy wires, leading up to that thing, because they're going to have to provide a huge amount of instantaneous power when someone pulls up and wants to fill their entire battery in 2 seconds. Not really 2 seconds, but you know what I mean. And when you do home charging, where the charging is a little bit slower and it happens over the course of the whole night, that actually avoids the need to do quite as much trenching and to put in really huge beefy wires, because you don't need to pull power quite as quickly from the grid. And so all of that also reduces the cost of charging. So we think that the key here is to have public programs, incentive programs, keep those going, make them even stronger if possible. Make sure we have standards to hold everybody accountable, and that's what Joshua and Carb are working on, and we're really happy to see where that has gone. And we need more and better charging, and particularly overnight charging, to help to make the economics feasible for everybody. That will get us there.
Thanks, Sam. A lot of benefits out there and a lot of challenges to tackle, but I know working together that we can make it happen. So appreciate that perspective. Shinpei, now I'd love to ask you a couple questions. So as global head of cities for Uber, who has set ambitious goals? Also, Uber has for 100% electric by 2030. Can you highlight a city that is best prepared to meet these goals on a local level? And can you give us an example of a policy or program that is working to support your efforts?
Thanks, Lisa, and great to be here and to be on this panel with everyone. Yeah, we also set these commitments, these goals of being 100% electric. And I think what's really important here is that that we aim to be as inclusive, that we think about these goals from the driver perspective. And so the short answer to your question is that, there isn't really a city that has a comprehensive program yet. Many of the policies, there's some great starts, right? And California is like a pioneer in electrification, but many of those programs were designed before rideshare existed, before we had a full understanding of the needs of drivers. What we are starting to understand, high carbon impact of high mileage drivers, but the total cost of ownership, all the reasons that the Terry and Sam and Jim have talked about, that calculation from both the upfront barriers, the cost, the acquisition of the vehicle, the charging, the calculation. I can't imagine the math that Jim might have to be doing as he's driving around the Bay Area, trying to figure out if he has enough to get to his next trip or even to get home. I mean, these things end up being very critical to how we want to really think about the design of the policy. And so I was just, thinking about some of the examples where we can learn from other places. And Uber is a global company, and our commitment is global. We want to be 2040, 100% zero emission platform. And I started working in London a couple of years ago. We launched a clean air plan that has generated 125 million pounds for drivers. 1,500 drivers have taken advantage of it to transition to EVs. We've committed, as part of our commitment, $800 million over the next 5 years by 2025 to help make this transition. And I think the thing to focus on there is the policy conditions are in place. There's a ultra low emission zone, congestion pricing that prioritizes EVs. And then you have the private companies coming in to help with filling the gap. And then we've also provided some funds to boroughs in London that are lower income to let the boroughs kind of decide where they can fill in some of those charging deserts, as Terry was describing. So I think there's some more of those pieces in place in London. Another great program is Amsterdam's Right to Charge, where essentially any resident without access to off-street parking charging can call up the local government, and they will get a guaranteed charge put in place somewhere within a block or two of their residence. So that gets to the ability to take advantage of the variable pricing of charging, maybe slow overnight charging possibilities. And I have to say with Amsterdam, it's so fascinating that they started this process of figuring out how to catalyze electrification adoption, electric vehicle adoption 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And only, I think within the next year or two, are they able to completely make it a market-based system. So for up until now, it has been completely subsidized by the government. And it's just an interesting case study. We don't have 10 years to wait. We're talking about 2025, 2030. We have to get moving right now. So I do think it's something to keep in mind about the need to not do it alone and the need for government participation. There's also, drivers that don't have access to credit to afford a purchase, leasing and really good started, but there are some limits generally to that because some of the electrification policies were created without that in mind per se. But I think Colorado and Massachusetts might have that. And it was great to hear Josh talk about that possibility with also secondhand markets. And you can also remove fleet caps so that there isn't, that anyone with a group of cars, anyone who's managing a group of fleet is able to take advantage of electrification. And I think in general, we're just like all really starting on this journey. I was actually chatting with Terry the other day. He was mentioning, the electrification, the electric vehicle adoption in Norway is like above 70%, but they have not yet even addressed many of the challenges that we're talking about for rideshare drivers. So really kind of focusing and centering the drivers in this conversation as we think about updating policy or creating new incentives is really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a new industry and it has its very unique challenges, and also trying to go electric and addressing the driver's needs. It's a lot to do, and it's great to see examples of what people are doing. But yeah, we have a lot more work to do. So thanks, Shinpei, for your perspective. So Molly, I'm going to get to you now. So welcome. So as director of the Three Revolutions program at UC Davis, can you briefly tell us about the Three Revolutions and what are the most important considerations when you think about racial equity and transportation equity as part of those Three Revolutions?
Thank you so much, Lisa. That's such a great question, a big one too. So, and thanks. I want to just thank Veloz for all the great work you're doing in this space, in this field. All of us at UC Davis, who are working on electric vehicles are familiar with your work, and really happy to be a part of this panel. So the Three Revolutions are, so my role, so let me take a step back, I'm sorry. So my role is a policy director and that's a translational role to convey some of the really fantastic research that's happening at UC Davis and within the UC ITS system, which is Davis, Berkeley, UCLA, and Irvine. And so there's some really phenomenal researchers at UC Davis that have done some great work on EV TNC behavior, Uber and Lyft drivers. And they've garnered a lot of research findings about how to maximize time of day charging, et cetera. But you didn't ask me about that. I just wanted to make a point that exists. And if people are interested in that research, they could contact me, or I can direct them on how to find that research. But you asked me about the Three Revolutions and racial equity, so I'm going to try to focus on that. So the Three Revolutions are these tides in transportation that we see as critical right now. The first, I would say, is shared mobility, and with that we include both transit, the OG shared mobility, as well as bike share, scooter share, et cetera. And then the second tide of innovation is electrification, and then the third tide we'll see is vehicle automation and and driverless. So this trifecta of innovations, will drastically lower costs of service. That, according to our research, it could reduce costs as much as 70%. But what the real critical element here is that if costs come down to that degree, then traffic could explode. And so the challenge, I think, is to keep shared mobility and sharing at the top of the agenda, because I think that's the least guaranteed of these revolutionary tides. I think shared mobility and encouraging pooling and increasing the number of people per vehicle is extremely important. We need to keep transit alive. We need to bring it back after the pandemic, roaring, and we need to make sure that it can work where it works well on our major corridors. This TNCs and ride hailing can play a role. But right now, CARB estimated that they emit 50% more emissions than the typical vehicle. And they also drive 3 times as much, as many miles. And that those two are related and not separate. I think that these high mileage vehicles are a really great opportunity to reduce emissions, but we need to also keep those passenger miles down. So we need to think about how we can get more people in the vehicles, create the right incentive structures where we're not just tying a tiny tax break to a shared vehicle like you might see in San Francisco, where you say you have a small tax on TNCs and you have a slightly smaller tax for shared vehicles. That's not setting enough of a price signal. So we need to work on that. And then, and not to say that these issues are separate, but I think the issues of how we ensure Black and brown people of color and communities of color can be, are not left out of this tide of innovation. I think this is extremely important. And we need policy leadership now to ensure that communities that have been historically underserved have a chance to embrace this technology and reap some of the benefits. We want, to think about, how do we make sure that that ride-hailing drivers, Jim is a fantastic, example of ride-hailing driver who was able to find an electric vehicle and keep it running and keep it operating. But many people feel like that isn't an option for them for many reasons. So we need to think about rental models, short-term rental models, and Shinpei, you mentioned this, and it's extremely important, but we need to make sure that those rental models aren't repeating some of the exploitative practices of the taxi lease models so that people can still profit while using these short-term leases. I think that may require policy, maybe some subsidy. There's possible ways that the public sector could partner to ensure that you have short-term rentals available so we can have nearer term EV access for ride-hailing drivers than may happen with the price point of the market. And the very last thing I'll mention, and I know I'm sorry, I don't mean to go on too long here, is about automation. Automation can be a little bit scary when we're talking about drivers, but there is going to be this tide of automation in the ride-hailing fleet industry that I think will happen slowly, and there is going to be a role for drivers for a long time. So the question is, what role will that play? Where can we think about ways that automation can also help us with our emissions and electrification goals? We know that a fleet of automated vehicles may be able to optimize for energy in such a way that current, a driver-operated and independently operated fleet, TNC fleets are, unable to do. So, so there may be some energy impacts that we can capture from an automated fleet, and there may be a way to transition. So we're using drivers as a bonus, as an add-on, without having to have mass layoffs. So I think there's an opportunity there as well. So I'll just pause there and happy to talk more about the policy side in the Q&A.
Thank you. We've got a lot of great programs you're working with and exciting things we plan to see in the future. And they really are, there are so many considerations that I think most people don't realize when we're thinking about these future technologies that I love just hearing about and the different solutions that you all come up with. So it's really fascinating. So Jim, I'm just going to go back to you real quickly. So first, do you have any thoughts based on what people are saying? I also really want to know, when you talk to fellow drivers and share your experience with electric cars, what kinds of things do you tell them? Do you feel like what kinds of things really resonate with them? And have you convinced any of your fellow Uber drivers and friends to go electric? I don't know if we're...
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I was lost there for a minute. All right. So say that again, because I got trying to figure this out.
I just wanted to get your experience as an EV driver, talking to other drivers, and how do you convince them to go electric? What kinds of things do you tell them? And have you convinced any of your fellow drivers to go electric?
Yeah, I have several people that I kind of mentor in driving, and I've shared with my plug-in electric how that was kind of an introduction to it. And then when I see the incentives, I say, man, you can go do this, get this car for this amount of money, which actually is, I was able to buy this new 2020 for about the same price as buying a 2-year-old one used with all the incentives. So it's showing people how to do that. And then how you guys have on your Facebook page, a lot of the different places you can go to where money's available from different counties and cities and all of that. And I think it's getting that information in front of drivers. I think drivers are scared of it more than anything of charging. The number one thing I hear is, well, how do you charge it? And how long does it take? And I'm somebody who's always trying to calculate how I can do that. So I've got into this mode of, instead of like, I do charge it all night at home, but instead of trying to wait until I have a quarter of a charge and then go find a charger and sit there for an hour or two and charge it, if I'm not at a ride and I have a charger close to me, but in San Francisco, that's pretty easy to find the direct currents, the EV Go, I can just go bump it up for 10 or 15 minutes and I get a ride, I unplug it and I go. So it's learning those kinds of processes that drivers need to know. It's not just that I have to completely charge it and I'm down for 2 hours. So that's one of the things I share with other drivers, and because I want to see it succeed. I really do now, especially now that I've been involved in it, and like the way it drives. And I have grandkids, and when I see my grandkids running around the house, you know, what's the air going to be like, and what's our air quality is going to be like for this next generation and generations after that. So I want to think to the future rather than selfishly. Now, I mean, now that I'm getting older in age, I'll put it, but still young enough.
No, well, yeah, we appreciate that. And those are really good motivations for sure on what you're doing. So appreciate it. So I'm going to ask Joshua another question here. So Joshua, when you developed the Clean Mile standard, how did CARB take into account the needs of drivers, especially those that are considered low income?
Yeah, it's a critical question, and it is a new type of regulation. So we've had to develop new approaches. Traditionally, we just require new vehicles to be sold by automakers. I'll mention 3 specific areas that I think are tangible. The first is that we try to be realistic with the cost projections. We have to make assumptions on future years, so there is some uncertainty, but we've tried to be realistic and not be too optimistic. And so one core area is that as we did our overall economic impact and the cost to the companies and the drivers, we kept our payback period short. We made it a 1-year payback period so that we weren't being too optimistic on lots of extra savings that would make this an easy switch for drivers. So that was a thing we were trying to be realistic with. The second is that when we finalized our proposal for the EVMT requirements, we made it a relatively slow ramp up in the early years. So the requirements are going to start in 2023 and go to 2030. But in the early years, because costs of the EVs are still coming down, there's a little bit of uncertainty on the charging infrastructure rollout. We have a moderate ramp up. And then the third one is that we did try to do a projection on how many used EVs were going to be available to drivers. And we know that there's a lot of drivers that are moderate and low income that are going to buy used EVs and not buy new. And so we made an assessment of how many used EVs 5 years from now are going to be available that are more than 200 miles range. And we think that with the Bolts today that are new, like the 2020 Bolt that Jim is driving, that's going to, in 2025, that would be a 5-year-old used car that might be on the market for Uber or Lyft driver at that time. So we tried to get to confidence that there would be a market for used vehicles that had higher range that would be workable for higher mileage drivers. So those 3 areas are, I think, tangible things that we've did that were new. The last thing I'll mention is that we did put a lot of thought in the last year here to, could there be targeted regulation efforts by the companies to help high mileage drivers, which a lot of them are lower income. We were not able to find a solution in the regulation, but we really learned a lot and want to work with the companies to ensure that there's outreach and education for those high mileage drivers to make sure they're aware of how to get the used EVs. So hopefully that helps, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. And I have a lot of other questions we are not going to get to right now, so we can take a few of the participant questions, but I do want to just ask each of you quickly, kind of do what we call the lightning round. Can each of you just, I'll call you in order, but can each of you tell us one thing that you would say is needed to make sure that transportation network companies their drivers can go electric by 2030. So just one thing. I'm going to start with you, Sam. Thanks.
Economics. We've got to make this cost effective right from the get-go, to Jim's points earlier, or otherwise people are just not going to be able to do it.
Thanks. Shin-Pei?
I agree with that. And I would say I would throw in charging infrastructure, just trying to ease some of that anxiety and making it possible. But charging infrastructure with the total cost of ownership in mind. So when Jim wants to pull over for 15 minutes while he's working, that's really different than having to pull over for 2 hours, for example. So those are considerations that are really important.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw in my add to that, and I think those tools that Jim mentioned, maybe that Uber and Lyft probably are adding for their drivers to give them the confidence of how to plan their trips. I think that sounds really important too. So that sounds like those are good tools to help with the charging as well. So Terry, I'm going to ask you, what's the one thing that we can really do or can be done to help drivers go electric?
So I think that Sam and Shin-Pei have taken two of the things, but I'll say awareness as well. I think that we have to ensure that drivers are aware, but then I want to kind of cheat and just put in their innovative strategies. I think that driver-centric approaches are really important and critical to this. I think that those folks who are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And so as we think about how to accelerate EV adoption, particularly around, amongst vulnerable populations, we need to really co-develop strategies that take into account, finance, charging, awareness, all of those things coupled.
Thanks, Terry. Molly, I'm going to ask you the question. Oh, we can't hear you right now.
Sorry, we have to have policy. I think we need government leadership to demonstrate how to do this and to subsidize where the market is not moving fast enough.
Thanks, Molly. Jim, I'm going to ask you, what's the one thing that we can do to make sure all Uber drivers go electric? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. It's really, I think, the incentive, because that's what drew me to it. And if manufacturers, like, instead of having the end of year $2,500 off, if the Ubers and the Lyfts can work with, and you guys work with these manufacturers to say, hey, this rideshare industry, we want to help them, can we get those kind of incentives year round, not just at the end of year model?
Great, thanks for that. Joshua, last but not least.
Yeah, the phrase I would say is charging access. I know the charging was mentioned by a few others, but to me, the access issue is the piece that's most uncertain as we roll out infrastructure in the next couple of years, particularly for drivers that do not have a garage, they don't have a home that they can invest in a home charger. We need to have urban fast charging that is at moderate speeds and not too expensive, so they can, charge up once a week like a gas station, or get the 15-minute top off in the city during service. And so I mentioned medium or, not too expensive, because the super fast chargers that are coming out now are going to be really expensive. And so we need to make sure there are options for the lower income drivers that are moderately fast and not too expensive, but they can take advantage of when they don't have a home charger.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Now I'm going to welcome my colleague and coworker, Margaret Moore. She's going to facilitate the questions from the participants. And then we'll do that just for a few minutes, but then I'll wrap things up. So Margaret.
Hello, everyone. I have some good questions from our audience, and they're directed, the first one is directed at Jim about what kind of trip information and pay structure, including with rental programs, would help drivers get into electric cars functionality. And Shin-Pei and Sam may be able to answer this as well.
I'm not sure on the rental side, because I've never rented a car. But the incentives that are there, the information that, the more information we get as a driver, that it's two things, that we can see it quickly because we have a matter of 5 seconds or so to make a decision, that, or it'd be nice if we had a little more time, but having that information is vital to any driver, because of if you're going to get short trips are not a problem. It's those trips that pop up that are an hour long drive and where you have to think about that. And so and you're driving down the road, there's a lot of things you're processing. So yeah, that information, as plain as it can be, is really important.
And this next question kind of relates, and it's for Shinpei and Sam, that, what are Uber and Lyft doing to understand the state of charge of vehicles in their fleet for the current range and then trip decision making that motivates pairing long trips with drivers with high state of charge? If that makes any sense. Does that make any sense the way I read that? Shinpei, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I was just going to offer something that we've done in London. I mentioned it a little bit, where we were offered some seed funding to the boroughs of lower income neighborhoods to start to fill in some of the gaps in the charging desert. But that was done through just some analysis of where we saw drivers were starting their trips. And there was this correlation between where existing charging infrastructure is and where they were starting their trips. And it was clear that there was a discrepancy in these lower income boroughs. So that's one thing that we're trying to do, is to just better understand what the lay of the land is. And also we hold regular kind of conversations and focus groups with drivers. We have a driver advisory council to just help us understand their needs. And that's really fed into then, things that we can help with, like total cost of ownership calculators, a better understanding of, what is on the, when you share the information about the trip, as Jim was saying, that those kinds of details end up being really helpful. And we'll just continue to be tweaking this as we go, to make sure that we're supporting the drivers as they make this transition.
Thank you. So Sam, what are some of the key messages that you see are resonating with drivers as your company looks to meet your ZEV goals?
I think it's really all about, I think it kind of gets back to something that Jim said, which is we got to make this a no-brainer here. And I think everybody in an ideal world, we all want to be driving an EV. We all want to be reducing our personal emissions and do what's right for the planet, but we've also got to think about our own personal bottom lines. And to do that, we have to make it a no-brainer, to use Jim's phrase. And so I think that, as we are able to develop these partnerships with the charging providers and the automakers and, regulators and everybody else in the ecosystem, I think that we can create that value proposition. And when we talk to drivers about, what would get you to switch, it always comes down to, well, make it easy for me. Make the economics work, make the charging work. This has got to be just the most no-brainer thing ever. And then why wouldn't I do it? But until you address those barriers, it's just too difficult, right? It's too difficult to do that mental math and all those calculations all the time. I mean, maybe, some can figure it out, but it's tough. So we've got to really make all these things work together and make it a no-brainer for drivers.
And one way drivers can try out the technology, right, Sam and Shinpei, are through your rental program. So that's, I think, a helpful way to maybe let them test the technology, because I know that might help alleviate some of the fears as well. So that's, I always like hearing about those programs. So I know we're 5 minutes away from the end of our webinar. So thanks, Margaret, so much for facilitating those questions, and thanks to the audience for asking them, and to our participants for the great conversation we've had this morning. So I really appreciate it. I'm just going to wrap up with a few slides to tell you about Veloz's upcoming activities and things that are happening. So I'm just going to go back to my shared screen. Oh, here we go. Here we go. So can you all see my screen? I'm just gonna, okay, it looks like I have some nods. So just want to tell everyone that we're excited to have just launched in January our 40 million reasons to go electric campaign. This is really lays in the awareness bucket. So we're trying to really raise awareness about electric cars, have people come to our electricforall.org website and search. We have a feature where you can search all the electric cars sold in California, the incentives for your zip code. So we are excited about this campaign. You can go to electricforall.org/campaign to view the video that features Mark Ruffalo, Chloe Bennett, who stars in The Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and some local heroes, and a really fun animation with a neoclassical song sang by Ayani, who's a Barbadian-born artist and lives in LA. So we hope you go visit the website, view the video, and share as much as possible to get the word out about electric cars and just get the excitement that we're hoping to really have through this campaign and get people to want to learn more about electric cars. I just want to also mention we've launched the Home Charging Advisor. So this is really to help people who've bought their electric car, who are looking at electric cars, to learn more about their home charging options. So you can find all the different home charging equipment available, what incentives apply for your zip code. And then in the next few weeks, very soon, we'll be launching what's called the incentive assistant. So you can go apply for all your incentives in one application form. So that's coming very soon, and we're excited to launch that feature as well. And then this is just a few of our upcoming events for 2021. So we're excited also to have launched our blog by our executive director, Josh Boone, called The Ride to Zero. So we launched this yesterday, and so he'll be doing this blog on a regular basis. So please visit our website. We have a blog link there to read his latest blog and the first blog of the series. We have our first member-only summit coming up July 13th, of course, virtually. So if you're not a member and you want to join, we can tell you more about membership. We have our last public summit of 2021 coming up on November 6th. Well, not coming up, but eventually November 6th. And then our 2021 webinar series. Our next one is on April 29th, permit approved, cities leading the electric car revolution. So learn what cities and counties are doing to streamline permitting and support electric car charging in their cities. Then we have a list of other webinars coming up that you can find on our website. And to sign up for EV News, please go to our website, veloz.org. You can sign up to get the latest news, latest events, everything going on with Veloz there, our summits, our webinars. Please follow us on social media and share where you can to get the word out. So we appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.